Hello, my name is Tyson Freeze, and this is my analysis of suicide data using um, Pandas, Python 3, Matplotlib, and a data set from Kaggle.com. First off, I'll show you these four graphs, which are going to be generated by the code I've written, and also um, how the code works and an idea of some of the things that can be learned by analyzing this data set. So to start with, we read in the master.csv, which is here. This is the data set from Kaggle. Um, and then we have a generic function called rates cross column, which will analyze different data sets, different data columns against suicide rates. We pass in arguments for that 4 times, which creates the 4 graphs, and we plot them here. So what happens is we have a data frame, which is Pandas' version of an SQL table, and we begin to manipulate it. We pass in a column that we want to analyze and potentially a column handler here or an order by column or an order by function. And we'll go over how each of those work. To start with, we filter away anything that's null and the excess columns. We keep suicide rates because that's what we're analyzing and whatever column we've picked. If we have a column handler, we'll process it. If we have an order by, we'll specify it. And then we average the rates grouped by the column. So we group by the column, sum it up, group by at the same level, and then average those things together. We sort them based on the order by, and then we plot it, which will log it in the queue to be plotted here. To be more specific, this column handler takes in the column we're analyzing, does some sort of manipulation, and then updates that in the data frame, in the table. And so here we, for HDI, for by year, will round to the second decimal place. For the order by, we specify what the order will be. We set that column to categorical, and then when we sort, it will sort using our order by. For GDP, we need to normalize the data so that way the graph would not be so jagged. You'd be able to identify a trend easier. We do that by dividing by 10 to the 5th, rounding to 1 decimal place, and multiplying again by 10 to the 5th to return the data to its normalized state. And last off here, we see ourselves removing years from the data set that are greater than 2015 because years in that date range aren't plentiful enough to create an accurate graph. This generic code is what allows us to create the 4 graphs and analyze them. Now I'd like to show you some of the things we learned, that I learned as a result of looking at these questions and these data sets. The first question was, what's the relationship between average suicide rates and the Human Development Index of countries globally over time? We see that in figure 1. What is the relationship between average suicide rates and the age of victims globally? That's figure 2. Rates and GDP per capita, that's figure 3, and how are average suicide rates trending globally, and that's figure 4. In figure 1, we see that as the country is more developed, the more developed the country, the higher the rates of suicide. There's a positive correlation there, which is juxtaposed with GDP. The higher the GDP per capita, the lower the suicide rates, up to a certain point, which then starts to flatline. And in figure 2, we see suicide increases with age. There's a positive correlation. And in figure 4, we have this weird graph. From 1985 to 1995, there's this weird increase, which I believe is a result of the underlying data set having not enough values for those years. And then a negative trend, which is a positive thing to note about the state of the world. The suicide is going down globally. One thing I'd like to note especially about figure 1 and 3 is that you wouldn't expect this. You'd expect as the country gets more developed that suicide rates would go down because people's quality of life is increasing with things like electricity and plumbing. In figure 3, we see you'd expect with more wealth in a nation, suicide rates would go down. And we do see that up to a point. As GDP continues to increase and increase, it has no impact on suicide. There's an asymptote. These two appear contradictory, but we can learn something. The key to a fulfilling life is not the amenities. That's not what makes life worth living. Um, Having enough money sufficient for your needs, that's important. That makes a big difference. Um, but it's the focus of our lives that matters most, not the frivolous things that can exist in the world. That's not what makes life worth living.